The silence on the bridge was deafening. Admiral Xyros stared at the flickering holographic display, his claws gripping the command rail. Entire warships vanished, not destroyed, not disabled, just erased from existence. It was impossible. No weapon in the galaxy could do that. His officers stood frozen, fear creeping into their expressions. The arrogance that once filled the room had evaporated. The enemy ship remained still, untouched, its black hull reflecting the light of the dying sun. It had spoken only one word: leave. Xyros clenched his jaw. Valkyrie did not retreat. They had conquered 100 worlds, crushed rebellions, and turned thriving civilizations into dust. They would not back down to a single, nameless human vessel. He forced his voice to remain steady. Target that ship. All forward batteries, fire at will. The command deck erupted into action. Weapons officers scrambled over control panels, entering firing sequences, their hands shaking. Across the Armada, warships charged their cannons, missiles locked on, energy cores humming with lethal power. In mere seconds, thousands of weapons fired at once. Blinding streaks of plasma, kinetic rounds, and nuclear warheads roared toward the lone ship. The void itself seemed to tremble from the sheer firepower unleashed. There was no escape, no maneuver that could save it. And yet, nothing happened. The human ship remained exactly where it was, untouched, as if the barrage had never existed. There was no shield impact, no damage, no explosion. The weapons had simply ceased to be. Xyros' heart pounded in his chest. Impossible. An eerie stillness settled over the bridge. Then, one by one, the remaining warships began to lose control. First, their targeting systems went dark. Then their engines flickered, failing without cause. Crew members screamed as gravity fluctuated, life support faltered, and systems collapsed. One of the captains appeared on the holographic feed, his face twisted in terror. "Sir, we're shutting down. We can't." His transmission cut off. His ship was gone. Panic spread like wildfire. "Admiral, our fleet is." The lights on the bridge dimmed. The air grew cold. And then, for the first time, the human ship moved. It was not a normal movement. No thrusters, no propulsion. It simply shifted, as though space itself bent around it. One moment it was distant. The next it was close. Too close. The massive dreadnought Razanth, the pride of the Valkyrie Dominion, was now face to face with the abyss. And then a second transmission came through. No voice, no words, only a sound, a heartbeat. Slow, steady, cold. It echoed through every speaker, every system. The bridge crew clutched their heads, their breathing shallow, their thoughts drowning in a presence that should not exist. It was inside their minds. Xyros staggered, gripping the console to stay upright. His own voice, once full of command, now shook with doubt. "What are they?" There was no answer, only the heartbeat. And then, darkness. Darkness swallowed the bridge. Every screen, every light, every display flickered and died. The heartbeat continued, slow and relentless, vibrating through the metal walls of the dreadnought Razanth. The crew stood frozen, their hands trembling over dead control panels, their breath shallow. Admiral Xyros forced himself to remain steady, but the silence was unbearable. He had faced death before, had stood on the ruined worlds of fallen enemies. But this was different. This was not war. This was something else. Then the lights flickered back on, and the screens returned. But the view outside had changed. Where once there had been a mighty Valkyrie fleet, now there was only emptiness. Thousands of warships had filled the void just moments ago. Now, only a few remained. The dreadnought and a handful of escort ships drifted in a sea of nothing. No debris, no wreckage, no sign of battle. The fleet had not been destroyed. It had been erased. Xyros gritted his teeth, his claws digging into the console. Status report. Where is the fleet? The sensors officer frantically pressed buttons, his face pale. Sir, they're gone. Completely. I don't understand. It's like they were never here. The remaining warships sent panic transmissions. What happened? Where did they go? We lost contact with half the fleet. No, more than half. Admiral, we need orders. Do we retreat? Retreat. The very word made Cyros's blood boil. Valkyrie did not retreat. They did not bow. But as he stared at the lone human ship, unmoving, untouched, he felt something he had not felt in decades. Doubt. The communications officer gasped. Sir, we have an incoming transmission. Cyros straightened. From the fleet. The officer swallowed hard. No, sir. From them. The bridge fell silent. A static-filled whisper filled the room. The voice was not human. It was distorted, layered, something far beyond natural speech. It did not ask. It did not threaten. It simply said, "You were warned." A chill crawled down Cyros's spine. The human ship had not fired a single shot, had not deployed a single fighter, yet it had dismantled his invasion force with ease. It had not needed violence, because it was something beyond war. The whisper returned, colder this time. Leave. Cyros clenched his fists. His pride screamed at him to fight, to unleash every weapon he had left. But deep inside, something else spoke, something he had never felt before. Fear. The human ship did not threaten. It did not negotiate. It simply gave him a choice. Cyros exhaled slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Order all remaining ships to fall back. His officers stared at him in shock. Sir. He raised his voice, his command sharp. Fall back. Now. The remaining Valkyrie ships turned, their engines roaring to life. They did not wait for further orders. They did not hesitate. They fled. As the Razanth turned to retreat, Cyros took one last look at the human ship. It remained there, watching, waiting. It had not pursued them. It did not need to, because it knew they would never return. You said. The Razanth and the few surviving Valkyrie ships fled through the void, their engines burning at full power. For the first time in their history, the mighty Valkyrie Dominion had turned its back on a battle. No, this had never been a battle. It had been a message. Admiral Cyros stood rigid on the bridge, his claws clenched, his mind racing. The human ship had not fired a single shot. It had not needed to. The fleet had vanished, erased by an unknown force. And now they were running like frightened prey. It was humiliating. It was impossible. But it was real. The holographic display flickered as the retreating ships entered the jump sequence. They would be out of this cursed system in moments. Cyros turned to his officers, forcing control into his voice. Once we reach safe space, we... The ship shuddered. It was not a weapon strike, not an explosion. It was something else. Something wrong. The stars outside the viewport shifted. They bent, twisted, stretching unnaturally. It was as if the universe itself was unraveling. The alarms blared. Sir, something is pulling us back. Cyros's blood ran cold. What? The Valkyrie ships were no longer moving forward. The Razanth, a dreadnought built to withstand the worst storms of war, was being dragged back toward the lone human ship, not by a beam, not by gravity. It was as if space itself had changed direction, bending them toward that impossible vessel. Full power to engines. Break free. Cyros roared. The ship's reactor surged, thrusters flaring with desperate energy. The escorts did the same, their combined might enough to move a small moon. It did nothing. The distance between them and the human ship closed. The void around them darkened, not like the emptiness of space, but as if something unseen, something ancient, was pressing in. A scream echoed through the bridge. One of the officers clutched his head, eyes wide with terror. They're inside. Inside my head, he collapsed, convulsing, his breath shallow. Others followed, shaking, gasping, whispering words in languages they had never spoken before. The whisper returned. You did not listen. Cyros's vision blurred. The walls of the bridge seemed to pulse, breathing. Reality itself was folding in on them. And then, nothing. The ship stopped moving. The pull was gone. The whispers ceased. The lights returned to normal. The human ship had disappeared. Cyros staggered back, gasping. His officers lay sprawled across the floor, some unconscious, others trembling. The surviving ships were still intact, still functioning, still there. But they all felt it. Something had touched them. Something vast. Something beyond war, beyond understanding. Cyrus's hands shook as he activated the jump sequence. This time, the fleet did not resist. They fled. The surviving Valkyrie fleet tore through hyperspace, retreating faster than they ever had before. The air inside the Razanth was thick with unspoken fear. Officers sat frozen at their stations, some gripping their consoles as if afraid they would be pulled away by unseen forces. Others murmured softly, repeating the same words over and over. They were never human. Styros stood in silence, staring at the forward display. His hands rested on the console, but his claws no longer felt solid against the metal. He was still here, still alive, but something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The moment they had escaped that cursed system, the whispers had stopped. The impossible heartbeat had faded. The presence had lifted, like a shadow retreating from the light. And yet, something still lingered. His fleet, what little remained, was silent. Not just quiet, silent. No one spoke unless necessary. There were no reports, no status updates, no demands for revenge. Because every single officer, every surviving soldier, every remaining ship's crew knew one thing. They had never been in control of that battle. Even now, the question burned inside Cyros's mind. Had they been allowed to escape, or had they simply been left alive for a reason? A chime broke the silence. Admiral, the communications officer said, his voice hoarse. We are receiving transmissions from High Command. They demand an immediate report. Of course they did. Cyros had left with a fleet that could have conquered an empire. He was returning with barely a handful of warships. He knew what they would say. The Dominion did not tolerate failure. Cyros took a slow breath, composing himself. He turned toward the officer. Put them through. The holographic display flickered. Within moments, a massive chamber appeared before him, filled with towering figures dressed in deep red ceremonial robes. The Valkyrie High Command. The Supreme Strategos, an elder Valkyrie with sharp silver eyes, leaned forward in his chair. Admiral Cyros, he said, his voice laced with cold authority. You were sent to wipe out humanity. Instead, you return in disgrace. Explain yourself. Cyros clenched his jaw. For a moment, his old arrogance flared. He wanted to shout, to declare that they had faced an unknown force beyond comprehension, that they had been lucky to escape at all. But something stopped him. The memories of the vanished ships, the impossible movement of the human vessel, the whisper that had spoken inside their minds. He could not explain this. No one would believe him. Cyros straightened, his voice controlled. We engaged the humans in battle, as ordered. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But we encountered something unexpected. The Supreme Strategos' expression darkened. Do not play games, Admiral. The fleet we gave you was the strongest in Valkyrie history. How could a primitive race destroy it? Cyros' claws tightened behind his back. He wanted to tell them that destruction had never even happened, that erasure was the more accurate word. But he knew these men. They did not believe in the impossible, only in strength and weakness. They were not what we expected, Cyros said instead. They had technology we could not anticipate. It was not a battle, Strategos. It was something else. Murmurs spread through the high command chamber. Some of the counselors scoffed. Others exchanged uneasy glances, but the Supreme Strategos remained still. "Are you telling me, Admiral," he said slowly, "that the mighty Valkyrie fleet was defeated by a single ship?" Iros hesitated. The words sounded ridiculous when spoken aloud. And yet, they were true. The Supreme Strategos' gaze hardened. "We cannot allow this humiliation to stand. We will not retreat like cowards before an inferior species. You will return to the battlefront immediately, with reinforcements, and finish what you started." Xyros's blood turned cold. That would be a mistake. The chamber fell silent. Several of the counselors bristled. One of them, a younger strategist, barely old enough to remember the last war, sneered. "A mistake. You dare to defy the Dominion's command." Xyros's voice remained steady. "If we send more ships, they will not return." The counselor scoffed. "And why is that?" Xyros met his gaze. "Because we are not fighting humanity. We are fighting something else. Something that let us leave." He let the words hang for a moment. "Next time, they may not." Laughter erupted from some of the counselors. The Supreme Strategos did not laugh. He studied Xyros for a long, tense moment. Then he leaned forward. "Admiral Xyros, your failure has disgraced this Dominion. You will lead a second assault, this time with every resource at your disposal. You will wipe out humanity, or you will not return at all." Xyros remained silent, because deep down, he already knew the truth. If they sent another fleet, no one would return. "You said." Admiral Xyros sat alone in his quarters aboard the Razanth, the weight of the High Command's words pressing down on him like a dying star. The Council had made their decision. A second assault was coming. And this time, they would send everything. Every warship, every dreadnought, every planetary assault craft the Dominion could muster. They believed the first attack had been a failure of tactics, a flaw in execution. They believed that overwhelming firepower would solve what Xyros could not. They were wrong. His claws tapped against the metal desk. He had seen what the human ship had done, how it had erased entire vessels, how it had turned the laws of war into meaningless scraps of history. This was not a battle of armies. This was something else, something far worse. And yet he was powerless to stop it. If he defied the High Command, he would be executed for cowardice. If he obeyed, they would all die anyway. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he said, his voice quieter than usual. The door slid open, revealing his second-in-command, Captain Rithos. The younger officer hesitated before stepping inside, his expression tense. "Sir," Rithos began, voice hushed, "the crew is restless." Xyros met his gaze. "Of course they are. We all know what's coming." Rithos stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's not just fear, Admiral. Something is wrong. The men, many of them, are having dreams." Xyros stiffened. "Dreams?" Rithos nodded. "Not nightmares. Not images of battle. Something else. They speak of shadows moving in places shadows should not exist. They hear whispers in their sleep, voices they do not recognize. And some," he hesitated, glancing at the floor, "some claim they wake up with memories that do not belong to them." A chill ran down Xyros' spine. He had barely slept since the encounter with the human ship, and when he did, his dreams were filled with something. He couldn't remember the details, but the feeling remained, like he had glimpsed something he was never meant to see. "Have the medics reported anything?" Xyros asked. Rithos hesitated again. "Sir, this isn't a sickness. It's not radiation poisoning or trauma. It's something deeper. It's inside them. And," he swallowed hard, "it's not going away." Xyros exhaled slowly. He had hoped that leaving the battlefield would end whatever had happened to them, that once they were far from the human ship, things would return to normal. But it had followed them. "Sir," Rethos said carefully, "if the High Command orders another attack." Xyros looked up. Rethos's next words were spoken so softly, they barely escaped his lips. "There will be no survivors." The admiral studied his officer carefully. He could see it in his eyes. Rethos did not expect to return from this mission. None of them did. For a moment, Xyros considered his options. If he disobeyed orders and refused to lead the second assault, he would be executed. If he tried to convince the High Command to reconsider, they would send another admiral in his place, one with more arrogance, less hesitation. And if he followed orders, he would be sending every Valkyrie ship, every soldier, every commander to their deaths. No, not death. Something worse. The human ship had let them go, but it had not done so out of mercy. It had done so because it wanted them to return. And that terrified him. The ship had not fought them. It had not even resisted. It had simply removed them, like a child clearing dust from a table. And now, it was waiting. For more. "Sir," Rethos asked again, voice uncertain. Xyros stood, his decision made. "Prepare the fleet." Rethos flinched. "You mean, we're actually going through with it?" Xyros met his gaze. "We will follow the High Command's orders." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath, something Rethos did not recognize. The captain hesitated, but then nodded. Understood. He turned to leave but stopped at the doorway. "Sir, whatever happens, it's been an honor serving under you." Xyros nodded. "And you, Captain." Rethos left, and the door slid shut behind him. The admiral exhaled, then turned toward the darkened viewport. The stars stretched endlessly before him, but his eyes saw only one thing, the space where that lone human ship had waited. He had no intention of leading the Valkyrie Dominion to slaughter. He would obey orders. He would take the fleet to war. But he had one last move left to play. And if the High Command refused to listen, then he would do what no Valkyrie had ever dared before. He would betray them. The Valkyrie Dominion had never launched an invasion of this scale before. Hundreds of warships, from swift attack corvettes to massive dreadnoughts, assembled in perfect formation above the Dominion homeworld. It was a force meant to break entire civilizations, an armada so vast that even the stars seemed to shrink before its presence. At the head of it all was Admiral Xyros, standing aboard the Razanth, watching the fleet prepare for the jump. He had given the orders. He had followed the High Command's decree. Every warrior aboard these ships believed they were about to claim the greatest victory in Valkyrie history. They did not know the truth. They did not know that Xyros was leading them to annihilation. "Admiral," Captain Rethos said quietly, stepping beside him on the bridge. "The fleet is ready. We await your signal." Xyros didn't respond immediately. He stared at the holo-displays, showing the readiness status of every ship. This was it, his final chance to act. He turned to Rethos. "Initiate the jump." Rethos hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, Admiral." Across the Armada, energy surged. Space itself trembled as the first waves of ships engaged their drives, vanishing into hyperspace, streaking toward the cursed human system. The countdown began for the Razanth to follow. "This is my last chance." Xyros's claws dug into his palm. If he did nothing, the fleet would arrive at their destination in minutes. And then, they would vanish. They would be unmade, just as the first fleet had been. No, he wouldn't let it happen. He turned sharply. "Override the jump sequence." The bridge crew froze. Rethos blinked. "Sir, I said override it. Now." Rethos hesitated only a moment before following the order. The ship rumbled as the jump drive's energy was redirected. Confused voices filled the command deck. "Admiral, the fleet has already jumped." "I know." Xyros snapped. He tapped into the fleet-wide command channel, his voice hard as steel. "This is Admiral Xyros of the Razanth. All ships that have not yet engaged their jump drives, Disengage immediately. Silence. Then confusion. Sir, one of the other ship captains responded. What's happening? Zyros took a breath. There was no turning back now. I am countermanding the High Command's orders, he said. Any ship that has not yet jumped must stand down. Gasps and murmurs filled the comms. Shock. Sir, that's treason, someone finished. Yes, it was treason. It didn't matter. Listen to me, Kairos continued, his voice stronger now. You have not seen what I have seen. The fleet we sent before never stood a chance, and neither will this one. Those ships have already jumped to their doom. He let that sink in. Do not follow them. Silence. Then, one by one, responses came in. A handful of captains acknowledged his order. They halted their ships, keeping them from leaping to destruction. But many others hesitated. Their loyalty to the Dominion ran deep. And then, a new voice came through. Admiral Tyros. A cold, sharp voice rang through the comms. This is Supreme Strategos Arvik. Cyros's blood chilled. The Supreme Strategos himself had patched into the transmission. You have disobeyed direct orders, Arvik said. His tone was quiet, but every word dripped with lethal authority. You will immediately resume the jump sequence, or you will be branded a traitor to the Valkyrie Dominion. Tyros didn't flinch. No. Silence. Then, Arvik spoke again, his voice like a blade. Admiral, do you have any idea what you are doing? I know exactly what I am doing, Axiros replied. I am saving what remains of the Valkyrie people. Arvik let out a slow exhale, as if disappointed. Then you leave me no choice. Alarms blared across the bridge. Admiral, Rithos shouted, several ships, ones that already jumped, have re-emerged from hyperspace. Cyros's eyes widened. That was impossible. No fleet, once engaged in a hyperspace jump, could return this quickly. And yet, as the holodisplays flickered, ships began appearing in real space. At first, Cyros felt relief. They survived. Then the readings came in, and horror gripped him. The ships were wrong. Their hulls were twisted, their once powerful exteriors now warped, as if something had reached into them and reshaped them. Lights flickered erratically, and the distress signals they emitted were not in any Valkyrie language. They weren't signals at all. They were whispers. The same whispers Kairos had heard in his mind when they first encountered the human ship. Then the first Valkyrie warship, one of the returning ones, opened fire, not on the Razanth, on itself. It fired all weapons inward, as if trying to destroy itself. The ship tore apart in a violent explosion, but even in its destruction, the whispering signal continued. Another ship turned its weapons on its own crew. Internal security feeds showed Valkyrie officers screaming, writhing, tearing at their own bodies as if trying to remove something that wasn't there. One by one, the returning ships collapsed, not in combat, not by enemy fire, but by something else, something unseen, something that had followed them back. Cyros's breath came in short gasps. He turned to Rethos, shut down all comms, cut off every external transmission now. Rethos obeyed without question. The bridge crew worked furiously, isolating the Razanth and the remaining ships from whatever had infected the others. But it was already too late for the Armada. The Valkyrie fleet was no longer an invasion force. It was a graveyard. Cyros stood in silence, watching as the once mighty warships collapsed into madness. A transmission flickered to life. The Supreme Strategos was still there, but he did not speak. He simply stared, his eyes wide. His face was pale, his mouth open as if trying to form words. But no words came. Instead, Cyros heard it. The whisper. You did not listen. The Supreme Strategos twitched. His body shuddered unnaturally. Then his transmission cut to black. Gyros turned away. We're leaving. Rethos swallowed hard. Where? Cyrus looked into the void, into the abyss that had claimed the fleet. Anywhere but here. With a final command, the remaining ships, the ones still untouched, turned away. Their engines roared as they burned as fast and far as they could. The Dominion was finished. And as Cyrus watched the wreckage of his people disappear behind them, he knew the truth. The Valkyrie had not been defeated in battle. They had not been conquered. They had been warned, and they had ignored it. Now, they were nothing more than echoes in the void. And somewhere, far behind them, in the darkness of space, the lone human ship still waited.